Resume recording. Go. Okay, and I am very happy today to introduce Jim Van Buskirk, whom I know from when I used to live in the San Francisco area. And I was very happy he was willing to give this talk to us today. He hasn't done it for a while, but he's now resurrected it and tested it out on a new audience. And we get to learn about his quite surprised reactions when he found out, what do you mean I'm Jewish? So please, Jim, elucidate us as to your history.
Thank you, Janice, and thank you for inviting me. And yeah, I completely, some of you may have seen an earlier version of this talk that I did, maybe 10 or more years ago, but I've completely reimagined it. So hopefully it'll be interesting and entertaining. Can you see, you should be able to see only my first slide, unpacking my grandmother's suitcase.
Nope, you need to share your screen again, Matt.
Oh, okay.
Oh, and I did forget to mention, we will take questions at the end. If you have questions during the talk, please put them in chat. We're going to allow plenty of time for discussion. And then after we've done any questions from chat, we will go to live questions. So back to Jim.
Okay, now can you see?
Yes, I can. I hope if anybody can't see it, please let me know.
Okay, so now I think I'm set. So I'm so glad you're here, and I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I'm going to dive right in, but please stay on after the presentation because my favorite part is the discussion. And I'm particularly pleased that my brother is on this Zoom. I don't think he's seen any iteration of this, so I should be on best behavior. And in fact, mentioning my brother, I'll show you an embarrassing picture. Here's our family, and from left to right, my younger, let's see, from left to right is me, my dad, my grandmother, my younger brother, John, and my grandfather. And I grew up knowing my grandparents as Baba and Pepe. And I knew they were not like other people's grandparents. They were from Europe and they spoke French and they were divorced. And we lived in the suburbs and they lived in Los Angeles, and I loved visiting them. Their sophistication was always a very welcome contrast to my boring beige suburban existence. So you can see what a sullen teenager I was. And you can also see that, like our neighbors in the suburbs, we celebrated Thanksgiving, Easter, and Christmas, especially Christmas. So let me introduce you to my grandmother. Her name was Georgette Simon, and she was French, and she was very tiny. She had a thick accent and always bright red hair. And I knew that she had been a performer and a recording artist in France in the 1920s and 30s, but all her discs had been broken on their way to the United States. But she took me to the movies and to fancy parties, and she promised I would inherit her custom-made ring and her opera posters when she died. And that will be a plot point later in the presentation. And here is my grandfather, Theodore Burns. And Pepe was smart, but sickly. He smoked, he sported a cane, and he always took pictures of us, which was very annoying. And, but he started a fund for my college. He sent me a subscription to Reader's Digest and made me read It Pays to Increase Your Word Power. He enrolled me in Children's Book of the Month Club. He really saw me for the writer, librarian, reader that I was to become. And I later learned that he was an alcoholic. And I had heard many times the story of my grandfather kidnapping my mother, Anne Marie, at the age of 6 out of France in 1933. And he took her to New York and then to Los Angeles, and my grandmother searched for them But then during World War II, she was stuck in Europe. So in 1945, she finally got herself to Los Angeles after the war and was reunited with her family. As Thelma Ritter might say, what a story. Everything but the bloodhound snapping at her rear end. But this story didn't quite square with the kindly gentleman I knew and loved. And I could only imagine that what this trauma had done to all the participants. So Baba was right. When she died, I did inherit her posters. I had them all restored, and here you see them hanging in my stairwell. But the ring was not forthcoming. And that might have been one of the many reasons I had been largely estranged from my mother for almost 2 decades. And when I got a call in 2005 from my brother telling me that mom's cancer had returned and that if I wanted to see her, I should do so sooner rather than later. So I immediately called her, and shortly thereafter, my partner Alan and I went to visit. And here's John and mom and me and Alan. And we hadn't seen each other for quite some time. And the very first thing she did was give me my grandmother's ring, which I had so desperately wanted for so many years. So the meeting went well. We were off to a good start. Um, let's see. So after this lunch, I got her to regale Alan with some of her many fascinating stories. And she said she had something to tell me. And she didn't want it to come as a surprise. She didn't want me to be upset finding out after she died. So what already do you have to tell me? You are Jewish. You are Jewish. You are Jewish. You are Jewish. You're Jewish. She must have said it 10 times and never altered the verbiage, not we are of Jewish heritage, or you have Jewish family members, or there's Jewish blood in our lineage, nothing. You are Jewish. And okay, let me take this in. And what I thought interesting was there are many historical figures who grew up ignorant of their Jewish heritage, one of the most famous being Moses. And I was fascinated by Moses, especially as he is seen depicted in Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 film, The Ten Commandments. So in 1966, I was 14, and the big budget epic was theatrically re-released. And I was impressed by the massive sets, the special effects, and probably the men's bare torsos as well. So early in 1967, I saved up my allowance and I splurged on the expensive double LP set of original soundtrack by Elmer Bernstein. And I listened to that thing incessantly. And for the junior high Halloween dance that year, I decided to masquerade as Moses. So mom and I used the picture of Moses on Mount Sinai from the album cover, and we shopped for brown and red fabric that she cut and sewed into a replica of Charlton Heston's Schmata. And meanwhile, I made the Ten Commandments out of thick pieces of cardboard in the shape of tablets, and I covered them with white butcher paper. And then I went into the World Book Encyclopedia and copied random Hebrew letters to form what I hoped would look like the Word of God. I even convinced mom to buy me a pair of sandals to complete the ensemble. Oh yeah, and one final thing. By the time Moses received the tablets, he had gray hair. So mom bought silver-colored hairspray to cover my dark brown hair. But it was still combed into its usual pompadour. So I don't think I much resembled Moses or Charlton Heston, but I won second prize at the dance. And needless to say, I no longer need the silver-colored hairspray. So when I asked mom at lunch why she had never told me, she said, "Do you remember Gentleman's Agreement?" And I knew that she was talking about the Gregory Peck film adaptation of Laura Hobson's novel about a journalist who masquerades as Jewish to uncover rampant anti-Semitism in America. And then later, I realized, oh, I had come out to her as a gay man by sending her a copy of another Laura Hobson novel, Consenting Adult. So we had both used Laura Hobson novels to reveal our big secrets, hers coming out as Jewish and mine as gay. But what Mom didn't know was that I had recently published a book called Identity Envy, Wanting to Be Who We're Not. And I'd written an essay, actually many years before, called At the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And in it, I describe all my many Jewish boyfriends, crying at a klezmer concert, attending high holiday services, the Jewish Film Festival, lighting my menorah every December, getting invited to Passover Seders, having a major meltdown in the Museum of Jewish Heritage. But I didn't understand why, what? Was I crazy? Did I have too many Jewish boyfriends? So I was still reeling from all these revelations. And I found this card at a Rainbow, and I sent it to Mom, and I never got a response. And I said, well, did you get my card? Yeah. Well, what did you think? Well, she thought I had made this card. But this was a commercially available card, which I thought was quite amusing. So I was still reeling from this revelation. And John and I drove Mom back to her apartment. And on the way, she said, oh, do you want to see Baba's suitcase? Well, what suitcase? Well, what's in it? Well, I don't know. I haven't looked at it in years. So Baba was my Auntie Mame. She was my Mary Poppins. Um, so her suitcase, of course I wanted to see it. So this is what I thought the suitcase was going to look like. But this is what the suitcase looked like. So the next day, we sorted through photographs and legal documents and correspondence, scrapbooks, photographs, and here was documentation of a life. There was correspondence about the kidnapping. There was a stash of Anne-Marie's letters. The contents of the suitcase raised as many questions as it answered. So I knew that Georgette's father was Henri Simon, a theater impresario, and her mother was Noémie David, daughter of Carolyn Levy of Alsace. And so did I suspect they were Jewish? Not really. Well, there was the Mogen David Loganberry wine in her fridge. And Mom said, oh yes, Baba liked that Mogen David wine. Well, nobody likes that wine. It's sickeningly sweet, syrupy, but that might have been a clue. So here are my grandparents, Baba and Pepe, Theodore and Georgette, young and in love. So what happened? They were married in, when were they married? 1926. No, they were married in 1925. My mother was born in 1927, and apparently the relationship went south. My grandfather gambled, my grandmother was accused of running around. I'm not sure what all happened, but in September of 1933, my grandfather said, oh, can I bring little Anne-Marie to the seashore before she goes back to school? Okay, sure, fine, whatever. And so then Georgette didn't hear from them, and she called the hotel, and the hotel said, well, he checked in, but he's checked out. Well, checked out, where did he go? Well, we don't know. So suddenly Georgette's husband and daughter are in limbo. They were on the lam, and she got a telegram from New York about 10 days later saying, everything is fine. We've arrived in New York safely, not to worry. Well, that wasn't the plan. What are they doing in New York? So Georgette goes to New York, looking, sets up a meeting through her lawyers with uh, her husband, and he never shows up to the meeting. And well, now where is he? What do I do? Well, she had contracts. She went back to Europe to continue her singing career, and she sent her mother, Naomi, to New York City. And here's a picture of Noemi with little Anne Marie in Rockville Center. So she stayed there about 6 months, and she told Georgette, "Don't worry, dear, I will not come back to Paris without little Anne Marie." Well, she hatched a plot and was going to sort of re-kidnap Anne Marie and take her through Canada and take her back to Paris, where Georgette was waiting. And uh, stupidly, she gave a letter to Theodore to mail for her. Well, he was no dummy. He must have opened it, read the contents, and that plan was not going to happen. So she was scheduled to, Meme was scheduled to leave to go back to Paris to Georgette without little Anne Marie. And the story went that on the eve of her departure, she was packing and she was probably keyed up, and she took some sleeping potion to calm her nerves. Well, then she forgot she took it, and she took more, and she died on the eve of her voyage. So the family all said, this is terrible. She was much beloved by everyone, including Theodore. And when I did further research, I found her death certificate, and the coroner found 10 times the normal dosage of the sleeping potion. So we'll never know for sure, but it's likely that Naomi could not face her daughter and committed suicide. When I asked my mom about this whole traumatic family story, she was so compartmentalized. She remembered some of it, but not other pieces. And I wanted to know, what did Theodore tell her about her mother? She said, "Well, I don't know. But we found these lots and lots of sweet little letters in French and in English that she had written to her mother. So she was in some kind of contact with her mother. And what about the big secret? So here's a letter which is, I think is, well, I'll just read it. It's dated the 13th of July, 1942. And Georgette's birthday was 14 Juillet, so this is the day before her birthday. "I, the undersigned pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Nice, certify that Mrs. Georgette Simon is a member of my church, which she attended diligently during her sojourn in Nice." Well, this is like a passport. This is to say Georgette Simon is not Jewish. Because I mean, it's pretty apparent if her maiden name is Simon, her mother's maiden name is David, and her mother's maiden name is Levy from Alsace. It doesn't get much more Jewish than that. So, so 12 years transpired between the kidnapping and when Georgette was able to get herself to the United States. And as she had found through FDR and the Red Cross, she'd gotten the address of her estranged husband and her daughter. And she was a US citizen, so she was able to leave Europe on one of the first transport boats. She got herself to New York, and eventually to Los Angeles, where she was reunited with her husband and daughter. And when I talked to my mother on another occasion about this, she said, "Oh, well, this was the best time of my life. I finally had my two parents together." But the story of the reuniting is kind of interesting. So the story went that Georgette arrives at this address and rings the doorbell, and she's expecting her little 12-year-old blonde baby. Or, I mean, I'm sorry, her 6-year-old blonde child. And 12 years have passed. And so a 18-year-old overweight brunette answers the door. "Well, who are you?" "Well, who are you?" "Well, I'm Anne Marie." "Well, I'm Georgette, and I'm your mother." And Anne Marie runs down the hall and says, "Daddy, Daddy, there's a woman out there who says she's your wife and my mother." And my grandfather was probably three sheets to the wind. He comes out of the back bedroom. I'm imagining all of this. And it's like, oh my gosh, she tracked me down. And the story, the way they told it was he saw the ring, the famous ring, and said, my gosh, c'est vraiment toi, Georgette. It's really you. He couldn't quite believe it. So what about Pepe? Um, so we, my brother and I, and he's knew our grandfather. We knew he was Theodore Burns. He was born in Brooklyn. His parents were John and Jenny Burns of Scotland. We knew all this. And John was the respondent on his death certificate. So this is what we knew. Well, my mother vaguely said, well, I think he might have been born in Russia. And she was a little vague on the details, but she planted the seed. So as soon as I got back to San Francisco, I went to the Jewish Genealogy Society's clinic at the Jewish Community Library. And led by Judy Baston, the genealogists were all very helpful, and they had suggestions for where to do the research, but we didn't really turn up very much. So I had some information, I had some misinformation, I didn't know what. But the next day after the clinic, one of the researchers, Steve Harris, sent me what he referred to as the smoking gun. And this is Theodore Burns' draft registration. And I don't know if you can see, but it says Theodore Burns and then in parentheses, Bernstein. And his place of birth is Pereyaslav, Poltava, Russia, which is now the Ukraine. So I later learned this is the town that Shalom Aleichem is from. So of course, I had to rewatch Fiddler on the Roof. This was my Pepe's people. And in fortuitous timing, I started working at the Jewish Community Library in 2007. And I got a crash course in Jewish history, culture, literature, holidays, and I dove headfirst into researching my Jewish genealogy. And this important resource was really the first way I knew what to do. And it helped me understand that this was as much a spiritual quest as a historical one, that this was a communal effort and not just a personal journey. And this was made manifest by the support and assistance of not only the Jewish Genealogical Society, but Jewish Gen, my colleagues at the Jewish Community Library. It was really heartwarming. And one researcher came out of the woodwork and found the ship manifest of the SS Nordam on which my family had come to this country. And here's the manifest. So it's probably too small to see, but you can see Zelda Burstein, it's misspelled, Tanya or Tanya, I can't tell whether it's a P or a T, Reuven, David, Rone, and Chaim. So this was my great grandmother, my Theodore's mother, and her children, although there's 5 children, and I knew that he only had, there were only 4 of them. So I'm still confused about part of it. And my mother was very helpful. I would share all these, the pieces that I find. I'd call her, I'd email her, and she would in turn dole out relatives. And she cautioned me about being too explicit about our Jewish heritage. And family members were a wealth of more information and a lot of misinformation. So one cousin shared a genogram, she called it, created by her late husband, Gordon Brandon. And on it were the names of my great grandparents. And they were not John and Jenny, but Jacob and Zelda. And so I immediately called my brother and I said, "Oh, isn't that interesting? You named your son Jacob, and our great grandfather's name is Jacob." But John wasn't very interested. He said, "Oh yeah, well, he was named for someone in my wife's side of the family." But I thought it was interesting. And she also sent me a photocopy of a photograph of my grandfather and his siblings. So so from right to left is Rose, who was born Rone, Edmund, who changed his name from Chaim, Theodore, my grandfather, in the middle, and his brother David. So then I knew to send away for their Social Security applications. And these were official documents filled out by the respondents themselves, not a census taker, not an Ellis Island official, and they were full of errors. The Rose and David, I knew, were twins, but you would never know it from looking at their Social Security applications. They had the names of their parents wrong. They said they were born in Brooklyn. They had the dates wrong. Everything was scrambled. So I never knew whether these were just honest mistakes or whether they were trying to hide something. Another story I heard was of my Uncle Dave. So Pepe, Theodore Burns, and his brother, David Brandon Bernstein. And Theodore would say, "Oh, and I would like you to meet David Brandon Bernstein, my lawyer," because these 2 men couldn't claim kinship. One was living as a Gentile, and one was president of his synagogue. He was a Purple Heart. He was Jewish. So how could 2 brothers be so different? So everybody referred to him as Judge Bernstein, and he had served as a judge for the International Military Tribunal between 1945 and 1948 in Frankfurt and Kassel. So I'm not sure I ever met him, but I had very vivid memories of his first wife, who we called Aunt B. So on a trip to Los Angeles, I searched the LA Times online database for David Brandon Bernstein, and I got 110 hits. I thought, well, I've done something wrong. I have to narrow this search. But it turns out they were all him. He was a Purple Heart. He was a lawyer for the firm that defended Sirhan Sirhan. Uncle Dave was a macher. And here he is with the governor of California, Frank Merriam, at a Wilshire Breakfast Club gathering in 1938. So my mom's health, which was not great, it improved enough for her to get to Paris one last time. This is where she was born, and she always wanted to get herself there. And I think John and I thought she was nuts to try such a big trip, but she was determined. And so I put her in touch with a dear friend of mine, Margaret Cleaver, and the 2 of them had tea together. And I was so glad that they got a chance to meet, because later I sent Margaret all over Paris, and she found, she went to the addresses where the family had lived, and she found a birth and death certificate for a child born to Theodore and Georgette that had only lived 6 days. So my mother was in some ways a replacement for that baby, and just adding to the trauma that she must have experienced. Um, so I met with a rabbi at Congregation Shahar Zahav who explained the concept of Pintele Yid, the spark of Jewish identity. And that's really what I felt. I felt like something inside me uh, had known something. Um, so with the rabbi's support, I went before the Beit Din, the panel of judges. I bathed in the mikveh. I delivered the drash services. And my dear friend Andrew Raymer said, well, you don't need to go through all that. If your mother is Jewish, then you're Jewish. But somehow I really wanted to repair the rupture in our family tree. So we had a ceremony in the backyard, and it was a birthday party. It was my early retirement from the San Francisco Public Library. It was a bar mitzvah. It was a wedding. And as you'll see in a second, it was a bris. And in my remarks, I told this story that I think we were at the Jewish Community Library, Andrew and I, and it was shortly after I had learned about my heritage. And I recognized a woman, and we were trying to figure out how we might know each other. And she said, well, with a name like Van Buskirk, I guess you're not Jewish. And I surprised myself by saying, well, you'd guess wrong. And I don't know who was more surprised, me or Andrew or the woman. It was my first coming out as a Jew. And everyone has assumed that Van Buskirk was a Dutch name, but John's wife, Kitty Ann's family is from Holland, and they said, well, we know no such name in the Netherlands. And my father had done some research, and I can't remember now what he found, but it turns out that Van Buskirk was a made-up name from a family, a Danish family that was settled in New Jersey. And he got the name from living on premises by a church. So Van Buskirk, Bus being woods, Kirk being church, was not European or even a bastardization of a European name. It was completely constructed like Burns had been constructed from Bernstein. So here's the bris part. My dear friend Claudia took it upon herself to make a big chocolate cake, which she proceeded to circumcise. So now mom was actively dying, and she finally took her last breath peacefully and painlessly in her own home on June 28th, 2008, just as she had wanted to do. So now our project was my project, and I had no one to ask questions of or to confirm information. And a few days after her obituary appeared in the local paper, I received this message. Jim, I saw your mother's obituary on Saturday. I believe she is my second cousin. My father's mother's Rose was her aunt. I remember visiting her when I was a child with my parents. We have some information on her father's family, 3 boys and 1 girl, coming through Ellis Island. We would love to know if you have any information. I live in Washington outside Woodinville and work in Seattle as a registered nurse. Let me know how to contact you. So here I'd been searching all over the globe for relative, not knowing that a cousin was living a few miles away. So when I spent a week clearing out my mother's apartment, I met my cousin for the very first time, and we compared notes, and we still stay in touch via email. But during my time in the apartment, I expected to find what my mother was so afraid of me finding. and nothing ever appeared. So sometime later, I got a birthday present package from John. And he said, "Oh, I thought this gift rather poignant and somehow fitting. Um, the loving, deliberate documentation of your early years is touching. And I also thought the family tree on page 253 has interesting and conspicuous blanks that would resonate for you. Love, John." And this is what he sent: the Better Homes and Gardens baby book. Well, where did he find it? I'd been in that apartment for a week packing up books and boxes. Um, and uh, he didn't know where it had turned up and wasn't even sure I would want it. I wrote right back, "Are you kidding? It's the greatest gift you could give me." And I wondered if there'd been a similar volume regarding John's development, but we decided probably not, because I remember my mother's dismissive comment that they took lots of pictures of the first child, me, but they didn't need many of the second child because he looked just the same. So uh, I don't know if you can read this, but there's sort of misinformation, there's incomplete information. So even in 1952, when I was born, they either didn't know or didn't care about the family tree. So on a trip to New York, I tracked down the death certificate for the woman we knew as Jenny Bernstein, and learned that she had died of peritonitis at New York Postgraduate Hospital on January 26, 1908. She'd only resided in New York after 2 years. She was 33. And this made sense because my mother had always insisted that her grandmother had died young. So Jenny's father was listed as what looked like Hedar Gobelman, and her mother as Lena Riven, both from Russia. And this made sense because some of my grandfather's siblings had listed her name as Gobert and Huberman. And I learned in Russia, G's and H's are pronounced similarly. So I was getting closer. So I emailed the death certificate to cousin Arlene in Seattle, and she said, "I'm interpreting the cause of death to be general peritonitis and intestinal obstruction." And it sounds like she continues. She sounds like she went in for surgery for pelvic pain, got an infection and obstruction, and died from sepsis. So another tragedy in the family. So when I returned to San Francisco, Judy Baston suggested calling the Washington Cemetery for more information. And the office confirmed that Jenny was buried on January 29th, 1908, age 33, and died of peritonitis. She was buried in cemetery number 2, post 187, row 4, grave 6, in Savard Ansha Peroslav, misspelling of Pereyaslav. So this was the area of the cemetery for the people from Pereyaslav. So this made no sense to me. I wrote all these letters down, and Judy confirmed that I had the right person. So Alan and I went to New York. We visited Washington Cemetery. It took us forever to find the headstone, because a century of the elements had all but eradicated the writing on the limestone stone. So Judy suggested taking photographs, which my friend Howard Friedman helped me decipher. So the irony of this didn't escape me, because after Baba died, I had discovered, I went to visit her grave, and I discovered that no headstone had been purchased. So my brother and I took it upon ourselves to order one, and we chose for her epitaph, La Chanson du Bonheur, Song of Happiness, which was the title of a Franz Lehar operetta, one of her major successes. And I had taken a portion of Mom's ashes, and I intended to scatter them somewhere in Paris. And after a few years, I realized I was not likely to get to Paris in the foreseeable future. So I gave them to Margaret and she scattered them in the Bois de Boulogne, which I thought was perfect because that's where mom used to like to play as a child. So here is little Anne Marie in Bois de Boulogne, where her ashes are. So my search was now winding down. And I had lots of information, I had loose ends, and some of this is never going to be answered. And as my detective work came to a conclusion, I believed that I was taking advantage of an opportunity denied to my family, preserving a tradition that they had felt forced to abandon. So I imagined myself climbing back up my family tree, and by choosing to identify as Jewish, I hoped I was restoring them retroactively to their rejected religion. And here is my mom, me, Baba, and Pepe. And here is my final image, Georgette and Anne Marie reunited in Los Angeles. So thank you so much. And now I really want to hear from you. So I'm going to stop sharing and if you have questions, comments, ideas, either put them in the chat or unmute yourself. Oh, and I wanted to highlight, Janice asked for a handout of resources, and I created an annotated bibliography of books about this, it turns out, very common phenomenon of people hiding their Jewish heritage, either formally or informally. So probably the most famous of these is Madeleine Albright, but this is a very, very common occurrence. So even though I think I'm very special, this phenomenon is not that special. So
You are very special, Jim.
yes,
All of us
I'm
know
sure
that.
I am.
We actually had Doreen Carvajal, one of the resources you listed. We had her as a speaker at, well before COVID. We had her as a speaker in person.
Yes, I think we had her at the Jewish Community Library as well, and her story is fascinating because it's the Spanish connection and how many crypto Jews hid their identity, and many of them are clustered in New Mexico. And I was asked to do this presentation many, many years ago and went to Albuquerque and did it. And there was a family in the back row, and they kept chuckling. And afterwards they came up and they said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We were laughing through your whole presentation only because everything you said resonated with our family." So it was validating that they had experienced the same situation from a different direction. So any questions, comments, ideas?
One of the extra Jim Van Buskirks, whose real name I do not know, has raised her hand. So yeah, you have unmuted yourself. Please speak.
Hi, Deborah.
Hi. My real name is Deborah Alexson, but I'm glad to be Jim for the. This was great. Thank you so much. My question, I guess, is obvious, but why? Why did they hide?
Well, that's the burning question, Deborah, and I have wrestled with it for the last 15 years. And I look at the sometimes insidious and sometimes overt anti-Semitism. I think every time my mother might have come out, might have revealed her identity, something erupted. I mean, so the Dreyfus affair in Paris, where she was born, the Rosenberg execution, all throughout history, there have been so many virulent episodes of anti-Semitism, and as we well know, we're experiencing them again, or still. So I think she was sworn to secrecy by her family, but by the same token, there was some ambivalence because she told me that she had, when she was engaged to my father, she told him and she told her future in-laws. She said she thought they had a right to know. By contrast, when she was in psychotherapy and her counselor told her, you need to tell your children. And she just couldn't do it. It was when she was facing her mortality. But just to compound the secrets, I later learned, so at this luncheon where she said, you're Jewish, you're Jewish. So my brother and I, we were there drinking coffee for hours and hours and hours. And on a trip to the men's room, my brother said, well, just so you know, she told me this secret months ago, and she told me not to tell you. So my poor mother just, she couldn't. And then when she said, well, you should write a book, you should tell this story. So I brought my little tape recorder and I sat down and started to interview her. And my brother's on one side of her and I'm on the other. And suddenly her face starts contorting and she's just she's flipping out. And I turned off the recorder and I said, what's wrong? And she said, well, it's okay to tell you these stories, but I don't want the public to know that I'm Jewish. So even in her 80s, at the end of her life, she was remarkably conflicted. So that doesn't really answer the question, but
it does answer the question.
That's what I was thinking. It really does, that she grew up in a world where being Jewish was such a negative thing. She kept wanting to hide it.
Right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just to continue. So I just think it's interesting that I hid my identity from her, my gay identity. And so the coming out to each other, but then she told me that she hadn't, let's see, how did she put it? Oh, I haven't told any of my friends that you're gay. I'm like, okay, well, I live in San Francisco. I was the program manager of the Gay and Lesbian Center. I wrote a book called Gay by the Bay. So you built another closet for yourself. You can't say anything about your firstborn son. That's kind of sad. And she said, oh yes, well, I don't want to tell them you're gay because then they would assume that's the reason for our estrangement.
Wow.
Like, okay. Oh, except for Alice. Well, who's Alice? So she had one friend that she could tell she had a gay son. So it just sort of shows how compartmentalized she was and how she was doing her very best. And oh, and one thing I'll say about my dear departed mother is, so our relationship from my perspective had been pretty toxic for many years, but after she revealed her secret, we had a rapprochement. She seemed much less toxic. We could focus on her family history. And so it was kind of a miracle that she could have taken the secret to the grave, but she gave me the greatest gift she could have given.
Oh.
I'm glad you were able to reconcile. But it's interesting. Mary Ellen said that she asked her uncle, it's like, why didn't you tell me? What difference would it make? You will be the same person before and after you find out, but you weren't the same person. It changed dramatically.
Marnie, what you were going to say something?
Hi. Oh,
Hi.
Jim, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I just appreciate it so much. And I just wanted to say that it's a measure of anti-Semitism that Jews either assume other identities or bond tightly in a tribal fashion, and that saved our asses for about 20 millennia. But this is a standard practice of Jews going back to Greek and Roman time, when Greeks and Romans took over the Holy Lands. You find a lot of Jewish folks with Romanized or Greek last names on their tombs. This is nothing new. This is as old as Jews. And also, I just wanted to mention something else, something that's come to light recently in this regard was Tom Stoppard has just written a play. It's on Broadway, I think, about his Jewish roots, which are fascinating. It's sort of like Madeleine Albright and sort of like your story, Jim. So I think, Jim, that's probably the theatrical version is next, I hope, for your story.
Well, yes, I'm so eager to see Leopoldstadt, but Marnie knows whereof she speaks. Can I tell your story, or can you tell?
Oh, sure. Take another hour.
Well, I just remember, so Marnie and I are good friends, and I can't remember how we reconnected, but anyway, when I told her my story, so her last name is Hall, and her brother Richard's semi-autobiographical novel, Family Fictions, is on the handout that I put together. And it's about a family who changes their name and becomes not Jewish. And so Marnie's family's name was Hirschfeld, but it was changed to Hall, just like Bernstein was changed to Burns. So she knows whereof she speaks, and she and I have a running joke that we're nouveau Jews, which is different from all you déjà Jews.
Well, your brother John actually posted something in the chat. My
good.
understanding is that your mother had promised other family members she would never share the information, but when she was going in for surgery and not sure if she would survive, she was afraid that y'all would be upset by finding the paperwork with all that information. So that's why she finally said it.
Right. And we never did. She said there was a suitcase with the name Bernstein on it. We never found it. She said there were documents with the word Israelite on it. We never found those. So either they never existed, or she destroyed them, or something. But yeah, John is absolutely right. She about the timeline.
Let's see, Rochelle, who's actually one of our board members, asked, did you use DNA in your research? And it doesn't sound like you did.
No, I did not. And but that's a whole nother story. My partner and I did do DNA research, and he found his birth mother. He knew he was adopted, and he has had a magical reconnection to a woman after 62 years of neither of them knowing anything about one another. Wow. So the magic of DNA.
That's true. And then let me see, one of the other Jim Van Buskirks came out and admitted he's actually Peter Wiley, who's working with you on a memoir of a Black activist.
Yes, that's right. Hi, Peter.
So it looks like that the activist was, the father of a Jewish son. Okay. Let's see. We have another comment about why they were taught, why they hid that they were Jewish. Perhaps since both parents were in the theater, they may have been hiding from more religious relatives like their grandparents, because that was considered a scandalous occupation for quite a long time.
Yeah, but I think that wouldn't make sense, because my grandmother didn't change her name. So she was Georgette Simon. Her sister, who was also a performer, did have a stage name. So I think, I don't know. Well, I'll probably never know.
We can keep guessing as long as we want.
Yes, indeed.
Did you? Okay, now Elias has come up. Did you find family members in any of the U.S. Census records listed under Bernstein?
I can't remember now. This research is probably 15 years old, and I don't have my notebook in front of me. I can't remember now what I found and what I didn't find. But one thing I definitely didn't find was my grandfather's naturalization papers, which makes me think that he never officially changed his name, changed his identity. I think he just, that one World War I draft registration is the only clue that he
Most
just
people did
switched.
not legally change their names anyway, so he would have been entirely the norm in that period. I mean, even now, you don't need to legally change your name.
Right.
Laura
Yes.
has raised her virtual hand. Don't forget to unmute. What is your question?
Jim, thank you so much. This was so amazing to hear. And I think obviously it needs to be a movie. I mean, you know. But I'm curious about what your grandparents' relationship was once she came to California. Did they reconcile? Did she, what, I mean, he kidnapped their kid. What was the relationship?
Well, that's the burning question, Laura. And, you know, John can weigh in as well. It was very complicated. So sometimes we would have one grandparent and sometimes the other, but obviously you saw pictures of all of us together. My mother had a very complicated relationship with her mother because she had been estranged for those 12 important years, but she adored her father. I mean, till the end of his life, she would call him every week. So you would think it would be the other way around, but and as I said earlier, when I asked her about that period, she was so happy to have her parents together. So I think she compartmentalized, and I don't know. John, do you have, oh yeah, John posted something. Let's see. I recall them as being very cordial to each other, genuinely interested in how and what the other was doing, and they enjoyed being at family events together. But my grandfather was a bit of a ne'er-do-well, and so I think he would try to borrow money from my grandmother, or he would make an appointment and then not show up. So he was utterly charming and brilliant, but he was a character, that's for sure.
But I think the death certificate listed him as divorced also. So did they actually divorce?
They did in fact divorce. She had been counseled not to proceed with a divorce while they were separated because it might impact the possibility of reuniting with Anne Marie. But I will share this detail, which I just remembered. So Anne Marie and Theodore were living together, and when Georgette got herself to Los Angeles and established residency, there was a housing shortage, but Anne Marie and Georgette got rooms in the same boarding house. So they were living together. So mom moved out from her father and lived with her mother. And so that showed that there was at least that connection. But I just remember sitting in a coffee shop with we'd park one grandparent in a coffee shop while we'd go visit the other one sometimes. So it was wacky.
Talk about compartmentalized.
Yes. I've learned from experts.
And let's see, Jean Gold made a comment about as far as some of their behavior. When data is all mixed up and combined with not finding naturalization, the person in question may have been trying to hide the fact they were not naturalized or were not born in the US. And especially since apparently he was later claiming he was born in a different place, that sometimes did affect whether or not somebody wanted to try to become an official citizen, because then they'd have to admit other information.
Yeah.
But layers upon layers of deception.
Indeed, making for
and you know, the whole thing about her being closer to her father, I don't know how much information you have about what he may have told her during that period that Georgette was not with them. Because that also will have affected things. What did he tell her about why mom wasn't there? And so she may have internalized a lot of that, so that when Georgette came back, maybe they couldn't be as close because Anne-Marie was thinking all these other things.
Right. Yeah. And the death of Anne-Marie's grandmother. I mean, just trauma after trauma after trauma. This whole episode has given me much more understanding and empathy for my mother, who, I mean, she was held together with rubber bands and paper clips. She did kind of an amazing job of holding herself together.
And she produced you and John.
Yes.
You know, and another possible entry for your resource list, by the way, especially since you included Doreen Carvajal, it might be Jeannie Milgram.
Oh, you'll have to send me that. I'm not sure.
She's another one like Doreen Carvajal who always felt Jewish. She decided to convert, and then when her grandmother died, she found out they were conversos, went back to prove her daughter was born Jewish, and traced her family through 15 generations of women.
Wow.
So the Bet Din could say, oh yes, you were Jewish. And then just to prove the point, added another 6 generations of women. You can't do that if you're Ashkenazi. You can only do that if you're Sephardic. But the fact that she did was amazing.
Wow, that's great. Oh, send me that citation if you would.
Okay, I will be happy to do that.
And I'll add Leopoldstadt, which I'd forgotten about.
That's right. And somebody said, nobody has told you welcome back. So welcome back to Judaism, Jim.
Thank you. Oh, well, here's a question. Are all your family members Unitarian? Well, so actually, I would say no. But my father would drag us to Methodist, Lutheran, I don't know what, every Sunday we would get up from the breakfast table and he'd drag us to one.
Flavor of the week?
Yes. And my mother would never go. And I said, so, well, how come you're not going? Oh, no, I'm not going. Well, so finally, in my bratty teenage way, I said, well, what religion are you anyway? And she said, I'm Christian. I'm Christian. I said, well, what does that mean? I'm Christian. And what I now think is that what she was trying to tell me was, I'm not Jewish. So.
Now, if your father, you said the family was Danish, so he probably was raised Lutheran.
Well, no, maybe way back.
Oh, okay, that far back. Dave.
Yeah, no, that he was, and in fact, Van Buskirk, it turns out, is a very common name. There's a whole newsletter, the Van Buskirk family newsletter, that I was subscribing to for a while. So all of these people with this name, which I always hated, I couldn't wait until I turned 18, so I was going to change my name.
I guess you
didn't
can
happen.
do it.
But these questions are great. But I would love to hear if
Elias
my brother
Elias said he found Theodore's passport on Ancestry. Passport app.
Oh, great. Boy, you guys are fast. Please
Hey,
send
we're
it to me.
genealogists.
Yeah, well, what a great tribe to be part of, that's for sure. I don't want to put him on the spot, but if John has anything to correct or clarify about this, I would love to hear from him.
Actually, I was going to invite him to speak up also. So
you don't have to, John, but if
there's John.
Hi there. This is John Van Buskirk. I'm 3.5 years younger than Jim. Jim, is great to hear this presentation. I read your write-up and we've talked over the years about it. So thank you for sharing, and great to see you appreciated and honored. I guess a couple of reflections. There's a lot of ironies here. Our relationship with our parents is completely different. So Jim and I spent 20 years screaming at each other about what life had been like growing up. And this is sort of a window in it. And so now fast forward, I think we are have kind of reconciled our relationship, get along well. Some of that was around rapprochement with our mother. And yeah, somehow this portion, she was a very complicated person, it turns out, very compartmentalized. And this was perhaps a big piece of that. I just finished a great book, I think great, on kind of a related topic called What Happened to You? And it's by Dr. Perry, a neuroscientist, psychiatrist, and of all people, Oprah Winfrey, really looking at not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, and a deep dive into adverse childhood experiences and how we're affected by really early childhood as well as adulthood things, and what that does to our emotional makeup and our identity, and how we react and frequently overreact to others, and then the downstream consequences of that. So one, I was going to recommend to Jim to read that. We often share ideas. Keegan recommended it to me. I said, yeah, well, whatever, I'm kind of busy. And I just thoroughly enjoyed it. Spent hours taking notes out of it because there's just a lot there. This would be one piece of it. Is I really appreciated Jim's remarks about ultimately having compassion and appreciation for our mother. And I think it's not to make excuses, but just some explanation, understanding of what life was like for her growing up, being denied her Jewish heritage, being denied, one of her parents, maybe both, if with Pepe's alcoholism, just a complex thing. So it made her very complicated. She was very tough, the most compartmentalized person I think that I've met. If you said, how are you? There'd be a long, excruciating pause. What do you mean, how am I? Or do you mean, how am I? Or what exactly do you mean by the question? It's like, well, never mind, I've lost interest by now. So mostly thank you for digging into this. I think the Jewish roots secret was no doubt a significant part of that. Again, I'm just compelled. The version of the story that I recall was sort of, I promised to never tell this. I'm not allowed to. And she was very cryptic when she finally shared it with me a little bit earlier than Jim, because really she thought she might not come out of surgery, and I'd find the paperwork and we would be all upset. And it's like, well, why then? Why under those circumstances? But it was as if she couldn't break a promise, who the promise was to, and under what circumstances. We can all make up a story. I think we don't know. So that's about all. And there's another irony here, I guess, if I get the stage for another hour, 20 minutes on the Van Buskirk Brothers show. I don't identify as Jewish. I haven't had any ethnically or spiritually. I have spiritual leanings toward Buddhism for another discussion another day. And ethnically, it's like really it's intriguing to me that Jim's Jewish, my mother was Jewish, my grandfather was Jewish, and it turns out I'm not Jewish. And I have a Christian friend born of Christian missionaries overseas who is much more interested in my Jewish heritage than I am. And it just cracks him up, and he's fascinated and intrigued and says, what a great thing to have this identity, and you could explore it. And it's like, yeah, I have lots of other interests that just doesn't resonate for me. So I'm talking to the wrong group about that, but just if you wonder how these two brothers 3.5 years apart end up where they are, here we are.
I'm so glad you raised that, John, because I remember a dinner at a Chinese restaurant, so that's pretty Jewish. John's son Adam said, well, Uncle Jim, I don't quite get it. How is it that you're Jewish, but grandma's not Jewish and dad's not Jewish? And all I could say was, pass the chop suey. I mean, I could not. Yeah, it's just interesting. I have immersed myself. I'm fascinated. I mean, it doesn't change my daily life. I don't go to services. But I do. I have mezuzah on the door frames. So I identify as a secular Jew. So it's just interesting how families converge, diverge, and I can't wait to read the book that John recommended. I'm ordering it as soon as we get off this. Which makes me think, are there more questions, comments, or should I let you get on with your?
That's what I was just about to ask also. Does anybody else have any other questions for Jim? If not, we will let him go back to the rest of his Sunday and he can order a new book, find out more interesting stuff. I'm not seeing.
I just want to say Mazel Tov, Jim.
Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate it. And
Yeah,
thank all of you for attending and for your interest and your encouragement. And be well, stay safe, and happy Sunday.
And thank you very much for sharing your day. And this has been recorded. It will be posted on the JGSO YouTube channel. We'll be announcing that through our newsletter when it is posted. If you aren't already up for that, you can email me at, and I'll put it in the chat. Email me and I'll make sure you are added to the newsletter. I'll also let Jim know when it's posted so he can alert all of his fans who might not sign up for a Jewish Genealogy Society newsletter. Well, thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day and have very good holidays, everyone. Bye.